In the tech hubs of Nairobi and Addis Ababa, who gets to decide what the future looks like? Developers in Nairobi and policymakers in Addis Ababa are currently drafting the scripts for Africa's machine age. Writing on July 20th, 2026, the author maps out how these competing stories will decide who controls the continent's resources. Some promise a digital leap forward, while others warn of new forms of extraction. The focus moves past technical jargon to the political stakes of the words being used. It asks which versions of the future are being made thinkable and which voices are being pushed to the margins of the conversation. Written by Scott Timke in Africa is a Country, narrated for Arva. The stories shaping Africa's AI future. From leapfrogging optimism to warnings of a new extraction economy, the frameworks now defining Africa's AI moment will decide who gets to shape the future and who is shaped by it. In the boardrooms of Addis Ababa and the tech hubs of Nairobi, a new world-making project is underway. Artificial intelligence, or AI, has become one of the central arenas where African states negotiate their position in an unequal global order. To speak of AI in Africa is not simply to describe the arrival of a technology, but to encounter a set of competing discursive frames through which political desires, developmental ambitions, ethical claims, and governance priorities are translated into technical agendas. As national strategies and regional protocols are rolled out, what comes into view is a struggle over how Africa is imagined within this machine age, and what kinds of futures that imagination makes thinkable. These frames are not simply different ways of describing a new technology. They are competing scripts for what Africa is, what AI is for, and who ought to shape its future. Some cast the continent as a site of leapfrogging and renewal, others as a zone of exposure, extraction, sovereignty, moral repair, or improvised adaptation. Each brings some actors and possibilities into focus while pushing others to the margins. That is why the issue is not only what AI means for Africa, but what pictures of Africa are being called into view through AI discourse. The first terrain is shaped by promise and protection. One of the most pervasive registers is promissory.
In the African Renaissance 2.0 frame, visible in the AU Continental AI Strategy, AI appears as a leapfrogging device through which Africa can bypass the choke point of traditional industrialization and enter prosperity through technical modernization. Here, the ethical subject is the developmental state or planner, charged with delivering growth, inclusion, and renewal. What comes into view is capacity, competitiveness, and beneficial transformation. What recedes from view are the historical and political economic conditions that make acceleration so attractive in the first place: debt, infrastructural dependence, uneven ownership, and the possibility that AI may deepen rather than overcome inherited asymmetries. Running alongside this is a protective register. In this vulnerability frame, Africa is not late, but exposed to surveillance, bias, exclusion, and systems introduced into settings where safeguards are weak and redress is limited. As the Civicus report on AI surveillance in Africa suggests, the issue is not only future risk, but already existing forms of technologically mediated harm. The ethical subject here is the harm-bearing population, the data subject, precarious worker, surveilled citizen, and linguistically marginal user most likely to absorb the costs of badly governed AI. This frame is ethically indispensable because it foregrounds rights, harm, and institutional fragility, including the uneven but growing architecture of data protection on the continent. Its limit, however, is that it can cast Africa chiefly as a site to be protected, rather than one from which technological futures are actively contested and shaped. A second terrain is shaped by structure and sovereignty. Alongside these promissory and protective registers sits a more structural critique.
In the anti-colonial frame, AI appears as a socio-technical order built through unequal material relations, not only data extraction, but also mineral supply chains, outsourced labor, environmental degradation, foreign-owned infrastructures, and asymmetrical control over the institutions that govern digital life. From this perspective, Africa is not outside the AI order looking in. It is already deeply inserted into it, though often on subordinated terms. The ethical subject is the dispossessed worker, community or polity, whose labor, resources, and data are drawn into AI systems, while ownership and value are captured elsewhere. What becomes visible is the political economy of AI, an approach that makes it harder to sustain the comforting idea that Africa's main problem is simply one of readiness or delayed entry. But the frame has limits. In foregrounding dispossession, it can flatten internal differentiation, externalize agency too completely, and become so totalizing that the uneven realities of negotiation and strategic inhabitation recede from view. The sovereignty frame shifts the question from extraction to control. AI is cast as a problem of authority over infrastructure, procurement, standards, and rulemaking, a concern visible in South Africa's national data and cloud computing policy. Its appeal lies in insisting that African states must govern technological systems in the public interest rather than merely consume them on external terms. The ethical subject is the sovereign polity, imagined above all as the state charged with authoring technological futures on its own terms. But sovereignty should not be romanticized.
Declaring authority is not the same as possessing material control, especially where states remain dependent on foreign cloud infrastructures, imported models, consultants, and opaque procurement chains. Equally, this frame can too quickly presume the state to be the vehicle of emancipation. A third terrain is shaped by ethics and language. Beneath these macro struggles lie cultural and ethical frames. In the Ubuntu frame, Africa appears as a moral resource, a source of relational vocabularies of dignity, community, interdependence, and solidarity that unsettle liberal individualism in mainstream AI ethics. At its strongest, this frame asks what kind of human subject AI presupposes and produces. Its ethical subject is the person in community, understood less as an isolated rights bearer, but as a being constituted through relations of community, solidarity, and mutual recognition. At its weakest, it risks remaining symbolically reparative and romantic rather than politically disruptive. A moral vocabulary that pluralizes AI ethics without redistributing authority over infrastructure, capital, or standards. The linguistic justice frame relocates the issue to language, depicting Africa as linguistically marginalized. Initiatives such as Lawapa and Masakane insist that language is not a neutral interface, but a site through which recognition and opportunity are distributed in digital life. An AI system that cannot adequately process Yoruba, Wolof, or Zulu does more than inconvenience its speakers. It helps reproduce a hierarchy in which some languages and the worlds they carry are made computationally peripheral.
The ethical subject here is the speaker, the language community, and the knower whose access to digital life is mediated through systems not built with them in mind. Yet linguistic inclusion alone does not resolve ownership, infrastructure, or power. An AI that speaks African languages can still be embedded in extractive or externally governed systems. A final terrain is shaped by markets and adaptation. The market pragmatist frame, visible in the African Continental Free Trade Area, or AFCFTA Protocol on Digital Trade, casts Africa as a jurisdictional space to be made legible to capital, a continent whose frictions must be reduced so that innovation, trade, and platform expansion can move more easily across borders through harmonization, regulatory alignment, and investment readiness. Here, the ethical subject is the investor, firm, regulator, and entrepreneurial ecosystem said to require clear rules and scalable markets. What becomes visible is efficiency, interoperability, and growth. What recedes from view is the fact that harmonization is never merely technical. It can distribute advantage, privileging certain actors over others, and can also displace questions of labor and ownership while eclipsing democratic accountability behind the smoother language of market access. The frugal innovator frame, the Juakali of tech, foregrounds small-scale, improvised solutions that work offline, on cheap devices, and in low-resource settings. Lalapa AI's Incuba LM is the sharpest contemporary example. This frame's appeal lies in refusing the assumption that meaningful technical work must begin from abundance. Africa appears as inventive under pressure, capable of repurposing constraints into forms of practical intelligence.
The ethical subject is the builder, bricolayer, local entrepreneur, and community improviser who makes systems work where industrial-scale infrastructures are absent. What becomes apparent is creativity, resilience, and situated responsiveness. But it can also romanticize necessity, making scarcity look like authenticity rather than a political condition to be transformed. It can overstate what ingenuity can compensate for and understate the need for public investment, industrial policy, and durable institutional support. In the end, what matters about these 8 frames is not whether any one of them finally tells the truth about Africa and AI. It is that each organizes moral and political attention differently, foregrounding development while muting dependency, naming extraction and harm while narrowing agency, valorizing language and ethics without redistributing material authority. As a constellation of concerns, they reveal less a single African AI trajectory, but a struggle over what Africa is imagined and allowed to be in technological modernity. That is why AI in Africa is not just about chips, code, or competitiveness. It is about who gets to architect the future, under what terms, and in whose interests. The stakes are not simply adoption or regulation, but the representational politics through which certain subjects, institutions, and futures become thinkable, while others fall from view. Yet these frames do not only describe Africa, they help make it where they are taken up. This is the world-making with which we began. What a frame brings into view becomes what institutions are built to serve, and what it lets recede goes ignored. Nor do the frames work alone. They overlap and prop one another up. Sovereignty talk can leverage the anti-colonial critique. Market pragmatism needs the Renaissance's promissory optimism. And the frugal innovator's ingenuity is enlisted to soften the very scarcity it works within. The future, then, will not be settled by one script defeating the others, but by which come to dominate the mixture, and whose interests that mixture ends up serving, as it hardens into the continent's legal, institutional, and material infrastructure. Whether this moment marks a structural shift or the repetition of old patterns turns on that.